Hello. This week's topic is the presidency, so please make sure you read Chapter 10 before attempting the written assignment for the week. But I wanted to give you a little bit of information on this topic. The American presidency was created in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Article 2 is the article dealing with the executive branch, and the framers of the U.S. Constitution vested all executive power in our government in the President of the United States. Now, obviously, the president does not work alone. Presidents have staff. They have the rest of the executive branch. The executive branch will be detailed in the next chapter, Chapter 11, the bureaucracy. But I do want to spend a few minutes on the presidency and give you some background on this topic. So, as I mentioned, the presidency was created in the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution were concerned about having too much power in the executive because they had gone through the experience with King George in the period before American independence. But they also knew that they did not want to have an extremely weak executive because under the Articles of Confederation, our first constitution, there was no executive and our country was very disunited and disorganized. So the American presidency was a way to kind of balance those two ideas. The reality is that the American presidency is a very strong institution, as we've seen in our history. Presidents from George Washington to the current one, Donald Trump, have exercised strong executive power at different points. And it's important that you read through a little bit of the history that's discussed in Chapter 10 to understand how presidents have functioned. Just a couple of things I want to give you some background on. One is on the roles of the president, which are discussed in Chapter 10. The authors refer to the roles such as head of state, chief executive, chief legislator, chief of party, and a couple of others I think are mentioned in the chapter. The head of state role is more of a symbolic function for the president. He or she is responsible for leading the nation, and in that role symbolizes the nation. Chief executive is really the substantive role of the president to run the government. That is the president's most important responsibility to carry out executive power. Within the chief executive role, presidents can make appointments to serve in their government, although a lot of those appointments have to be approved by the Senate. Presidents can issue executive orders, which is an important issue. Executive orders allow the president to carry out laws that have been passed by Congress or to carry out powers that the president has in the Constitution. Now, many presidents have used executive orders. Actually, every president has used them, going back to George Washington. In recent years, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and continuing through the current president, presidents have used executive orders frequently to carry out important responsibilities that they feel they have, and sometimes to get around Congress. We've seen that happen very recently with President Trump in his orders to weaken the Affordable Care Act and also his effort to reverse President Obama's DACA order, which allowed the children of undocumented immigrants to stay in the United States if they had been here for most of their lives. And that's a topic that's an evolving issue. But executive orders are a very important power of the president. They're controversial. Some people question whether they're constitutional sometimes, but generally the courts have not struck them down, although occasionally they have. So the other roles of the president: commander-in-chief. The president is the leader of our military. That's a role that's listed in the Constitution. The framers of our Constitution did not want the president to have complete power, but they did want the president to be in charge of the military. But keep in mind that the power to declare war belongs to Congress, at least in the Constitution, although the reality is that presidents have sent troops into battle many times in our history without getting declarations of war from Congress. The party chief role is more of an informal role for American presidents. They are responsible for leading their political party and symbolizing that. So certainly Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party today, and though he may not have been the choice of many Republicans, because he was the voters' choice in the primaries in 2016, he is now the leader of the Republican Party. A couple of other things I wanted to mention from Chapter 10. The authors discuss the role of the Vice President in the President's administration, so please make sure you read through that. Obviously, Vice Presidents are elected along with the President on the ticket together. Vice President becomes President if something happens to the President, if the President dies or is impeached and removed, or the President resigns. We've had a number of Vice Presidents who've become President on the death of a President, and we had one Vice President who became President on the resignation of a President. That was when Richard Nixon resigned in 1974, and Gerald Ford, who was from Michigan actually, became President. That's the only time that's happened in American history. Neither of our impeached presidents were removed from office, so we've never had a president become president on impeachment. Finally, I wanted to discuss a little bit the staffing of the presidency. Obviously, when a president has so many responsibilities to carry out, he or she cannot do it alone. And so every president has a staff of people, and the staff has grown significantly since the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt. That is when Congress passed the legislation that created the Executive Office of the President, the EOP. So every modern president has had an established staff who get government salaries, but those people serve at the pleasure of the president. The Senate does not have to confirm them. At the top of the staff is the chief. So every president, since in recent times, has had a chief of staff. And then within the staff, you have several hundred people who work either in the West Wing of the White House or next door to the White House in the Executive Office building. And they help the president with policy advice and press relations and speech writing and advancing his trips to different places and a number of other things that a president has to do regardless of which party. The people working in the staff are loyal, meaning that they are not, they only serve while that president is in office, and a new president picks his or her own people to serve in those roles. And there's a frequent turnover even during the president's term because these are very intensive jobs where they spend lots of hours doing the work. So people burn out very quickly in these jobs. But the staff is a very prestigious position to have in Washington, and these are people who help the president do his job. All right, so those are just a few things from Chapter 10 I wanted to highlight. Make sure you do read the chapter very carefully and then answer the written question. And if you have any questions this week, send me an email. All right, have a great week. Thanks.